Good morning, my name is Zahra, and I'm extremely honored and excited to introduce Ms. Rangita de Silva de Alwis, a tireless advocate for women's leadership and a leading human rights scholar who has worked vigorously to develop human rights and women's rights initiatives globally. Ms. de Silva de Alwis received her LLM and doctorate in law from Harvard Law School, and she was a research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. This past summer, she was appointed as the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative, an initiative designed to promote networks amongst current women leaders and mentoring and training among future women leaders. And that's an initiative at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Ms. de Silva de Alwis also directed the Women in Public Service Institute last year right here at Wellesley College, and she was the inaugural Susan McGee Bailey Research Scholar at Wellesley Centers for Women. She currently serves as an advisor to the Secretariat for the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and has published widely on law reform, gender, and human rights. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Rangita de Silva de Alwis.
Thank you, Zara, for that very warm welcome. And thank you to the leadership of the Albright Institute. It is always a really rare and much cherished delight for me personally to be with the Albright Institute. And it has been a place, I have to tell all of you who are the newest members of this ever-growing assembly of emerging women leaders of the world, that this is a place where magic happens. And I can vouch for that in so many different ways. I just received an email from one of your fellow Albright sisters who I met just 2 years ago after my talk, at which I had shared narratives of women who changed the world, women who make history in their communities and in the world. She came up to me and she told me the story of her grandmother in India, who at that time was at the forefront of the women's movement. This 85-year-old woman who was someone who was the stuff of legend in India and in the South Asian region. And I spoke with Surina and I told her that she must take this opportunity to write both the personal and the historic narrative of her grandmother. And she did that. And during the time that she spoke with her grandmother over the phone, over Skype, getting in touch very deeply with her own history, Surina's own history, and the grandmother's legacy that was so rich, she lost her grandmother within that period in which she was writing the story of her grandmother. But I think the biggest honor that she has paid to her grandmother and her family in India is this narrative, this very rich narrative. And she wrote to me last night to thank me for inspiring her to write this history and telling me that she has been offered by the Harvard Law Review and UCLA's Law Review a place in which to publish this narrative, this historic and personal account of her grandmother. So what I want to tell you today is seize every opportunity to create change, to transform your communities and the world. This is the place where magic happens. This is a place where you're going to realize your dreams. And this is a place where your dreams are going to take wing. So do not miss this opportunity to realize your dreams. I want to speak now of another young woman whose dreams are shared by women all over the world. The story of Malala, and it is a global call to action. And as we celebrate Malala Yousafzai's release from hospital, just 2 days ago, my talk also pays tribute to the young Indian woman who was brutally gang raped a few weeks ago in India. Though my talk focuses on Malala and is a clarion call to action by the global community, I will draw insights from the stories of both as they intertwine in the overarching narrative of violence against girls and women in the world. There is a war against girls' education in certain parts of the world, and you as future leaders must address it as one of the most horrific threats to humanity. And that is your charge. We honor Malala, an extraordinarily brave 15-year-old girl who survived an assassination attempt for her determined efforts to defend girls' education in Pakistan after the Taliban outlawed schools for girls in the beautiful Swat Valley in Pakistan. Stand up for Malala, stand up for girls' rights to education is now the rallying call that has galvanized and resonated around the world. And every young woman now calls herself, I am Malala, in solidarity with Malala. But Malala's story is not new in Pakistan. The attack against Malala shocked the world because of Malala's luminous courage, her glowing spirit, and her heroism. But there were many Malalas who were sacrificed at the altar of extremism and fundamentalism. And I'm going to speak to you about one of those, Mukhtaran Mai of Pakistan, who was also a Malala. Mukhtaran Mai was gang raped, just like the young Indian woman a few days ago. Mukhtaran Mai was raped as vindication for an alleged offense committed by her brother. In February of 2002, Mukhtaran Mai was repeatedly gang raped by 4 men in the village of Meerwala in Pakistan. While she pleaded mercy, hundreds of jeering villagers watched her being raped outside of the hut. She was then forced to walk naked back to her village. The tribal council of the Matsoi tribe had ruled that Mukhtaran Mai should be raped as punishment for an alleged offense that was committed by her brother. The alleged offense was that this young boy, had an affair with a rival tribal member. In actual fact, what had happened was that he had been sodomized by the tribal members of the rival faction. But instead, the Matsoi tribe, in order to cover up this offense, had ruled that young Mukhtaran Mai was to pay for this alleged offense against a family and the tribe's honor. So let's listen to Mukhtaran Mai's own words as is memorialized in a play. Malala's voice is different, but there are parallels with Mukhtaran's story. While Malala was taught to be outspoken and fearless before her attack, Mukhtaran grew in courage only after her attack. Mukhtaran Mai says, no, I was taught something. I was taught silence. I was taught fear. I was taught that some people are high and some people are inferior. I learned to hide my face and bow my head. I had never heard of the Constitution or realized that I was a citizen of Pakistan and that in Pakistan, even women have legal rights. In my whole life, I had never talked to a lawyer or a judge or a policeman. But this Mukhtaran was not the same woman who had kneeled down to the Matsoi. Now, as you know, Malala writes in her journal, all girls have a right to learn. Malala learns to write so as to tell her story in very vivid and moving terms to the world. Mukhtaran does not know even to sign her name. When the policeman attacks the police report that she files, he says, you must not say you have been raped. We know the truth. But Mukhtaran says, I know what happened to me. Sign, says the policeman. I can't. I don't know how to write, says Mukhtaran. Use your thumbprint like other women, says the policeman. But at the end, Mukhtaran too is a Malala, crying out for girls' education. She says, this is when I understood that all girls must have knowledge. If you are educated, you can fight for your rights. But when you are illiterate, you're like a dumb animal. Your mind has nothing written on it. So she cries, a school for the girls. A school for the girls in my village. We are so ignorant. We know nothing of the world. Girls must learn how to sign their names with a pen instead of a thumb. They must learn to read, to write, to know their rights as citizens. Help me, I implore of the women who have benefited from their education. help me build a school in my village. So Muktaran says, I set up a school in a field and go from house to house, pleading with the parents to send their daughters to school. And every day, more little girls arrive with notebooks and pencils. They learn maths, social studies, and English. But more so, they learn that women are equal with men, and that all of us are human beings, and all of us must be treated with respect in society. And then Muktaran, in very, very powerful ways, say, my school is not just for girls, it is for boys too, because boys too must learn that under Islam, under the law, women have the same rights as men. So what she speaks so evocatively and poignantly of is the importance of boys' education. And that is what Malala's story is about too, that it is not enough to educate girls. Boys must be educated on women's equality. And the quality and the nobility of education must empower both boys and girls. And the highest form of empowerment is tolerance and belief in justice and equality. So if Malala is to be a lightning rod for reform, what can we do? What can you do? What can the world do? My first suggestion, and I am going to recommend, and I'm going to share with you a roadmap for the way forward, a set of recommendations, 8 recommendations that will help us transform the story of Malala and the story of the woman who was raped recently in such shocking manner in India. So strengthen lawmaking and enforcement, name a pioneering law on anti-rape, criminalizing violence against girls' education after Malala, and an anti-rape law after the young woman who was raped in India. The father of this 23-year-old Indian woman who died last week after the brutal gang rape has endorsed the idea of naming this law after his daughter. And this would be a living memorial to this brave young woman. This law, if it is named after her, would be a way in which to honor her legacy. A law that is named after a young woman who stood up against this brutal attack would not be a clinical piece of legislation, but would always remind the world of the tragedy that took place, a tragedy against humanity. And that is something, some good that will come out of this horrific attack. Similarly, in 2006, in Brazil, in the case of Maria de Penha, a young woman who was brutalized and rendered a paraplegic by her husband, was memorialized in a law. The anti-violence against law in Brazil is now called after Maria. It's called the Maria de Penha law. Do you see the powerful nature of naming a law after a woman who was a victim of an attack that the law sets out to address? This is not a piece of legislation on a statute book. These are not empty words, empty legal phrases in a legislation or in a legal system. This becomes a living law, a living memorial to women who have suffered before a law came into force. So the case of Maria de Penha in Brazil revolutionized the global landscape on domestic violence lawmaking and is a tragic example of the urgent need for state responsibility. Maria de Penha would not have been rendered a paraplegic if, when she called law enforcement 17 times, the law enforcement, the police had responded to her call in effective ways rather than ignoring her pleas for help. She took this case before the American Court of Human Rights, claiming that the Brazilian state was responsible because it had acted in a state of impunity. It had abdicated its responsibility by her and by all women for not acting with due diligence. The court agreed with her and asked Brazil to draft a domestic violence law that was powerful, that was effective. And the current president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, who at that time was was a very powerful legislative aid to the minister who was charged with drafting this law, took it upon herself to draft this law and call it the Maria de Penha law. And that was one of the pioneering laws that was named after a woman in order that the world would never forget Maria. And I think that is why it's so important to name a law that addresses violence against girls' education in Malala's name, and to name an anti-rape law in India in the memory of the young woman who was brutally attacked last week. Perhaps one of the most critical factors of the Maria de Penha law is that it enshrines the need for education. So this is one of the first laws that really looks at some of the underpinnings of violence against women and addresses the root causes of violence against women. So it calls for gender equality education and human rights in the curricula, to be included in the curricula of schools, and most important, for young men to become educated on issues of sexuality and violence. So this is a very comprehensive law that reaches far and wide to address some of the causes and consequences of violence against women. So in India too, changes have occurred because of horrific crimes against women. In the legendary case of Visakha, a 50-something social worker, Banwari Devi, was gang raped by a group of upper-class influential men because she had tried to stop the insidious practice of child marriage. This appalling injustice, together with the fighting spirit of Banwari Devi, inspired several women's groups to file a petition in the Supreme Court, in the Indian Supreme Court, under the collective platform of Visakha. They demanded justice for Banwari Devi, but more so urged for broader action on sexual harassment at work and in the workplace. So this rape case spawned a whole lawmaking exercise. The Supreme Court, because there was no law in India at that time that addressed sexual harassment, used the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Global Bill of Rights on Women, the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, as the pivot to address these issues that were absent in the Indian legislation. So the CEDAW became the interpretive tool. The CEDAW became the resource for lawmaking, and using the CEDAW, the Supreme Court called upon the government to create Visakha guidelines on sexual harassment, which now have become the founding principles of a law that is being drafted on sexual harassment. So using again the Visakha principle, the Indian women's movement is galvanizing around this horrific act that took place over the holidays to call for similar guidelines and laws on anti-rape. So what this tells us is that violence against women must be defined as a human rights abuse. As soon as we evoke the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, we are highlighting the fact that violence against women is not just a private offense. This is not an offense that is committed against a woman by just private actors. This is a human rights offense. This takes place, as Fareed Zakaria said very clearly on GPS on Sunday. The rape that took place in India shows a failure of the state. It took place in a climate where the state abdicated its responsibility to protect its women. And that is why all violence against women is a human rights abuse, because it is preventable. As a human rights abuse, the state must be held accountable. And so let's also examine the way a right to education is a human right. The CEDAW, as a global bill of rights for women, is the foremost global tool in the work for true gender equality in the home, the community, and in schools. The CEDAW in Article 10 calls upon state parties, all states, to take measures to eliminate discrimination against women in order to ensure that they have equal rights with men in the field of education. But nowhere does it talk of violence against girls in schools and in travel to schools. So what I recommend is that the CEDAW, the Article 10 of the CEDAW, be clarified with a general recommendation to be adopted on violence in schools and in travel to school. It is not enough to guarantee equal rights to women's education. We have to guarantee that women are able to access schools in a way that it is safe for girls to travel to schools and that schools are safe spaces for girls to remain in schools. So how do we retain girls in schools? The CEDAW committee has recommended that countries take steps to improve girls' school attendance, including addressing the poverty and social pressures that push girls out of school. For example, the CEDAW committee has encouraged Bolivia to adopt measures to address the lack of infrastructure, distance, cost of transportation and language barriers that keep women and girls out of school. So I would recommend that the CEDAW committee also recommend ways in which to keep girls safe in school and in travel to school. So there is a new category that must be introduced into international human rights jurisprudence, a new category of law, a new category of human rights that addresses safety in schools, a human right to education that sees violence against girls as a threat to the right to education. So from Bangladesh to Bolivia, states have created effective food for education programs. States must now build on that. That is not enough. Food alone. Food alone is not enough to keep girls in school. We have to develop peace plans to keep girls in schools. And the same effort that was put into creating those food for education programs should galvanize states to create peace plans to ensure that girls are able to access school, travel to school safely without any threats to their security, and to be able to remain in school and see schools as safe spaces. In the light of violence against girls who attend schools, how do we guarantee regular attendance? As we know, Malala's case is a symbol, a deeply powerful symbol, but it is not the whole story. Acid attacks against girls attending schools in Pakistan and Afghanistan are rampant. A real man would never throw acid on the face of a little girl. A real man wouldn't even want to make a little girl unhappy. Afghan President Hamid Karzai said shortly after an acid attack against schoolgirls in Afghanistan. Besides, he said, it being a cowardly act, it is an un-Islamic act. But the state must do more to make sure that placing barriers to education is un-Islamic. So it is un-Islamic on the part of the state to allow violence against girls attending schools to take place. So the culpability, accountability must be placed on the part of the state. The state cannot abdicate its responsibility to realize the guarantee of the human right to education for girls. The threat to the right to education of girls is also not just a human rights threat, it is also a threat to development outcomes. The commitment to girls' education as a human right is in part based on the importance of girls' education in ending poverty. For example, the CEDAW committee has noted that poverty is more widespread in families headed by women who have received limited education. The CEDAW committee has applauded commitments to providing free secondary education for all as a means of poverty alleviation. And the flagship report of the World Bank, the World Development Report of 2012, makes it very clear that gender equality is not just the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. And in Pakistan, the World Development Report states that even one extra year of education for a mother results in better educational outcomes for children. As we know, nearly 2/3 of the world's illiterate adults are women, and 2/3 of its unschooled children are girls. When women and girls are educated, it benefits not only them, but also their families and their communities. Education also results in lowering child mortality rates. The World Bank states globally about half the reduction in child mortality during the past 4 decades can be attributed to improvements in educational attainment in young women. Women's education leads to healthier, more prosperous societies. So it is not just a human rights issue, it's a powerful development issue. As many of you know, in September 2000, leaders from around the world ushered in the new millennium by adopting the Millennium Declaration. And Pakistan was also a signatory to the Millennium Development Goals. And these goals form the basis for national development efforts. So my third recommendation is that violence against girls, access to schools, and retention in schools must be adopted as an important indicator in the follow-up work of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, especially in Millennium Development Goal 2 and 3, which speak on children's access to education, primary education, as well as women's equality. So the indicators must be broadly conceived, must be broadly conceptualized and reimagined to include the issue of violence against girls in schools and in their access to schools. So not only is education a human right in and of itself, but education also impacts development outcomes. It is also one of the most powerful vaccines against child marriage and forced marriage. An end to child marriage has now become the clarion call of the new century. And many major initiatives have embraced the threat of girl-child marriage. And elders and leaders such as Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, Desmond Tutu, Graca Machel, who was the former president of Mozambique, have created what is called this huge campaign called Girls, Not Brides. And Desmond Tutu has said, I call on men and boys everywhere to take a stand against the mistreatment of girls and women. It is by standing up for the rights of girls and women that we truly measure up as men. We ought to do everything in our power to ensure girls can become all they can be. And I want to broaden that call to end child marriage by using education, mandatory education, as the vaccine to end child marriage. And this call, this clarion call, must be broadened by a statement that says we have to do everything in our power to ensure that girls go to school, access school, and remain in school. And as part of that call, I would like the World Bank to conduct a study on how the absence of girls in schools harms development outcomes. And this must be both a qualitative and a quantitative study. In 1994, a World Bank study was very influential, a study done on 10 selected risk factors facing girls and women from the ages of 25 to 45. And the World Bank found that rape and domestic violence was more dangerous than cancer, motor vehicle accidents, war and malaria all put together for women. So gender-based violence not only violates human rights, but it also hampers health and productivity and reduces capital and undermines economic growth. Moreover, a 2003 report from the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that the cost of intimate partner violence in the US alone exceeds US 5.8 billion per year. And at this time, when Congress is reauthorizing the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act here in the US, I want to make sure that these numbers are heard loud and clear. In the US, 4.1 billion is used for direct medical and healthcare services, while productivity losses due to intimate partner violence accounts for nearly US 1.8 billion due to absenteeism. So a similar study must be done on the productivity losses and the development losses because of the absence of girls in schools. My fifth recommendation is violence in access to education must be conceived as a crime against humanity. My purpose is to serve humanity, Malala once said in an interview, with a maturity well beyond her years. Like so many young people today, Malala is helping to change the world. Malala's passionate advocacy shows the power of aspirations for human rights to move history. The UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, the former UN Special Representative, Ms. Margot Wallström, in February 2012 said, "It has become more dangerous to be a woman fetching water or collecting firewood than a fighter on the front lines." Similarly, it has become more dangerous for girls to go to school in certain parts of the world than to be a fighter in the front lines. So turning points will not happen. Turning points in the history of the world will not happen simply through condemnation of the attack on Malala Yousafzai. More must be done in real concrete ways to transform the jurisprudence, the human rights jurisprudence, to transform national and local laws, to transform law enforcement. So how do we do this? How do we imagine, reimagine, and mobilize in support of education, violence in access to education as a crime against humanity? The evidence is clear. Malala, in reacting to the destruction of schools in Swat Valley, says in her famous blog, 5 more schools have been destroyed. One of them was near my house. I'm quite surprised, she says in her innocent way, because these schools were closed. So why did they also need to be destroyed? UNESCO's 2011 Global Monitoring Report reveals that children and schools today are on the front lines of armed conflicts, with classrooms, teachers, and pupils seen as legitimate targets. The consequence, as one UN report puts it, is a growing fear among children to attend school, and among teachers to attend classes, and among parents to send their children to school. So this is a widespread and systematic and systemic way of blocking girls' access to schools during times of crisis and war and conflict. And this therefore amounts to a crime against humanity. Saluting Malala's courage, UNESCO has offered these sobering reminders of the global situation. In Afghanistan, more than 100 high school students from the Taka province were poisoned by fanatics hostile to girls' education. They are also subject to acid attacks. In Mali, young girls are married by force, recruited by militia, and prevented from going to school and leading a dignified life. Malala is the symbol of all of these young girls who are denied education in a systemic manner. So if we are to honor Malala and her courage and make sure Malala's sisters can go to school, a new category of crimes against access to education must be defined as a tool of war. And that is one of the recommendations that I want to make at this, which I think is an incubator for recommendations to impact the world's community. The ICC, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1994, declared rape to be a war crime. And that revolutionized the whole jurisprudence of what was considered war crimes. Violence against women, gender crimes were now defined as violence, as war crimes, as threats against humanity. And in that case, Jean-Paul Akayesu of Rwanda, who had allowed for rape to take place in his province, was prosecuted and found guilty of allowing rape to take place as the mayor of Rwanda. So what you see in this is that although you could not prove personal culpability against Akayesu, the fact that he allowed for an environment of impunity, a culture of impunity, suggested that he was guilty of the rapes that were committed. And I think that is the basis of what we are talking of in the case of Malala. When states and communities allow girls to be attacked, to be assassinated because of the fact that they are exercising their right to education, states must be held liable. Those communities who are responsible for protecting girls' access to schools must be held liable. And that is why it is so important to define access to education and any threats to the access to education as something that impacts humanity, is a crime against humanity. So in this context, let's also examine the rape case in India. Five New Delhi police officers have now been suspended for lack of prompt action following the rape attack. As we know, when the officers were called, they spent some time arguing over the jurisdiction of the crime. There was no prompt action that was afforded to the young victim, whose life may have been saved if the law enforcement responded in ways that they should have responded. And as I said before, Farid Zakaria of GPS has said, a government that simply does not deliver is at fault in this case. Rape happens because it is allowed to happen. It happens in a culture of impunity. India has the fewest number of police to the population, inadequate number of prosecutors, and despite the fact that in India rape happens every 23 minutes, only one rape was prosecuted in Delhi in 2012. So compliance with due diligence calls upon states to strengthen law enforcement to respond effectively to violence against women, and inaction or delay in action or ineffective action by state authority would create a lapse in due diligence and thus hold states' responsibility and the states accountable for violence against women. So in the final analysis, the state is accountable in both the case of Malala and the young Indian medical student's rape and death. So we also need to, in that same vein, call for a UN Security Council resolution addressing violence against girls in access to schools. Over the past 2 decades, international law has for the first time recognized both the gender-specific impact of conflict and the central part that women play in resolving conflict and in building peace. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 of 2000 calls for the participation of women in the process of building peace and in conflict resolution. In what we call in Security Council Resolution 1325, women are pivotal to the prevention and resolution of conflict, and it calls upon all parties involved in armed conflicts to engage and involve women in conflict resolution. And Security Council resolution, which was actually a resolution that Secretary Clinton brought forward, calls for an end to the use of brutal acts of sexual violence against women and girls as a tactic of war, and an end to impunity of the perpetrators. So we have room within that Security Council Resolution 1825, which calls for an end to the use of brutal acts of sexual violence against women as a tactic of war, to broadly define it as brutal acts of violence against women and girls access to safe spaces in educational institutes as a tactic of war, especially when it is perpetrated by extremist fundamentalist forces in the communities and their countries. So what I would call for is either a broadened reading of Security Council Resolution 1820 or a new Security Council resolution which really places threats to girls' education at the forefront of peace building. And this is not something that I think is unreasonable. As we all know, acid attacks against girls going to school in Pakistan are common. The recent acid attack law of Pakistan, which was actually passed in Parliament, helped to pass in Parliament by a Wellesley graduate, and I'm sure, you know, all of you are heirs to women leaders who are changing the world. And I think it is so important for you to understand your own rich legacy as Wellesley graduates, as Madeleine Albright fellows, that your peers as well as those from whom you inherit the mantle of leadership are out there changing their communities, changing their countries, and changing the world. So you are heirs to a very rich legacy, and I want you to mine that legacy, to really exploit that legacy to its fullest, and to understand what you inherit. So she was one of those parliamentarians in parliament who pushed for the anti-acid law in Pakistan, growing out of a law that was passed, the pioneering law that was passed in Bangladesh on anti-acid, which also called for the control of the sale of acid. Just like a gun control law, even the sale of acid must be controlled, because you cannot control an acid attack unless you are able to control the way in which acid is sold without any kind of limits or controls to the sale of acid. But what must be understood in that law is that acid attacks against girls who go to school is not just a private attack or a private crime. It is also a public crime, because of the fact that acid is allowed to be sold without any controls in a way that is arbitrary, and therefore the state that sells acid without having any controls over the sale of acid should be also held responsible. And when she spoke to me about this law, she said one of the things that she regrets was that they were not able to put into the Pakistani law the same controls that were placed in the Bangladeshi law on controlling the sale of acid. So that is once again a charge for you. This is something that you have to do going forward as leaders of your world. And finally, I would like to ask for reparations for violence against girls' access to schools. And there too, there is precedent for this. In the government of Mexico, in Gonzalez and others versus Mexico, a case where many women had been subject to sexual violence, the court declared that reparations should be oriented to identify and eliminate the structural factors of discrimination underlying gender inequalities. So see the difference in this ruling. So the ruling called not just for what I would say retaliation, but also restitution and rehabilitation, and looking at ways to address the structural factors of discrimination that allowed for gender discrimination and violence against women. So here again too in India, in the wake of this horrific act of violence against women, not only should rape be addressed, but the underlying factors that lead to the subordination of women must be combated. And I think that is where the women's movement in India has really mobilized and galvanized around. The fact that this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is what happened a couple of weeks ago is just a symbol of what happens all over India. And that unless we use that moment, that horrific moment, as a way to address some of the underlying factors of patriarchy and misogyny, that violence against women is going to go unabated. So this is a wake-up moment, not just for India, but across the world, that violence against women must be addressed and the root causes must be addressed. Constitutional guarantees on education must be made real. Both the Constitution of Pakistan as well as the Constitution of India guarantee education. The Constitution of Pakistan promises free and compulsory education to all children in Pakistan, and the Constitution of India, as amended in 2006, calls for the state to provide free and compulsory education to all children of the age of 6 to 14 years in a manner that the state might determine. So these guarantees are already enshrined in the constitutions of both India and Pakistan. But as we know, the state of girls' education in Pakistan is far from optimal. There are 7.261 million children out of school at the primary level, and a majority of them are girls. And the recent attack on Malala must galvanize the state to make real those constitutional guarantees. And in the past 50 years, half of the world's constitutions have been drafted, and women now have the opportunity to be at the negotiating table, at the law drafting table, at the constitutional drafting process, and they must seize that moment to write gender equality into the legal fabric of their countries. And in this call, I am not just asking our sisters in the South Asian region to make real these guarantees, but as you know, at this moment in time, the constitutions of the MENA region, the Middle East and North African region, are being rewritten. So women must seize that opportunity to be there both in the process of writing a constitution. What is called a process-driven constitutional making must be privileged, where the process is as important as the substance of the constitution. Who was at the table when drafting the constitution? Were all voices heard? That is the first step. And the second step is to guarantee that the substantive aspects of the constitution be enriched by plural voices, by many voices, so that women too can enshrine within this supreme law of the land, the constitution, guarantees that safeguard the rights of women to go to school and remain in school. So I would call upon all our sisters in the MENA region to use what happened to Malala and to the young woman in India as a lesson to acknowledge within the constitutional framework that violence against girls and women is a human rights violation. And finally, men's leadership is critical to their daughters' education. And Joe, that is why I'm so thrilled that you are one of the founders, along with our indefatigable founder who envisioned the program, because it is so important that men embrace and champion gender equality and women's leadership as something that is not just a women's issue, but a human rights issue. And men's leadership is critical, but that does not mean that women's leadership is in any way something that should not be the cause of our times. Women's leadership, and that's the high note on which I am ending, women's leadership is the cause of our times. It is the clarion call that you all hear and you will all heed. And this is the cardinal importance of the Madeleine Albright Institute, because all of you are at the forefront of the cutting edge of changes locally, nationally, and globally. And women's leadership is the bedrock of the work that we are doing at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars through the Global Women's Leadership Initiative, which is also the home of the Women in Public Service Project. The Women in Public Service Project was launched by Secretary Hillary Clinton in partnership with the State Department and the historic Seven Sisters colleges, including Wellesley. And Wellesley was really at the forefront of launching the whole Women in Public Service Project's pioneering program here at Wellesley College in the summer of 2012. So this is really hallowed ground for the Women in Public Service Project. The Women in Public Service Project was incubated here. This is the crucible of leadership for the Women in Public Service Project. And you're all heirs to that project. You're all shareholders. And you are stakeholders to that project. Many of your peers were part of that program as interns, as fellows, and continue to work with me at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in different ways as research assistants in compiling the global policy review, which will map women's leadership, especially in the area of women in public service around the world. But that will get me back to my final point, where women's leadership is really integral to addressing patriarchy and men's reluctance to send their girls to school. Studies done, one particular study done by Rohini Pandey of the Kennedy School of Government and Esther Duflo of the MIT Poverty Lab shows the positive effect of exposure to female leaders has on men. So we know the positive impact of female role models on girls and the intergenerational impact of role models, female role models of girls. But that also has an enormous and enormously powerful impact on the men, on the fathers. Because when women leaders are visible in communities in India, this study shows where female leaders at the local government level, the Panchayat Raj, are more visible, fathers tend to have higher aspirations for their daughters. So these are very concrete, in very concrete terms. So this is not just in aspirational, hortatory terms, but in real, impactful, concrete terms. Fathers tend to send their daughters to schools and keep their daughters to school in schools and delay their daughters' marriages and have higher aspirations in terms of employment opportunities for their schools because of the visibility of women leaders in the communities. So you see how women's leadership has an impact on the community in so many different and so many nuanced and enriching ways on girls, on the intergenerational impact, as well as on boys and on the fathers. So what I have done is to attempt to map the way ahead after Malala through a call to action both locally and globally. But as you know, the international women's movement has been altered after Malala, and this is now known as India's Arab Spring, Pakistan's Arab Spring. But what I would say, it's an Arab Spring for all women. And in an interconnected world, we are all Malalas. And you, as you come together as Madeleine Albright Fellows and as emerging leaders, you're the bearers of the charge, you're the standard bearers to make these recommendations real. Thank you.
My name is Lori. Thank you very much for this lecture. It was really inspiring. I just have a question with regard to your first recommendation. You mentioned
Oops, I'm just going to get some water.
You mentioned the need to create laws that condemn sexual violence and discrimination against women. And I know, for example, in several countries in Africa, we already have some laws like that, and then a lot of countries have ratified CEDAW, but sexual violence still occurs. So I don't know, what would you suggest to us as emerging leaders when we want to go into a field or work in a country where lawmakers fail us, where they're corrupt, where they don't necessarily, we're supposed to be a democracy and the people are supposed to elect those people, but they're not necessarily doing work that benefits us. So.
Right. Your question goes to the very heart of the problem, and I'm so glad you raised it. And if you remember, what I said was that we need to not only make new laws, but enforce the laws that are already on the books. The implementation of law is as important as making new laws. And 139 countries in the world have domestic violence laws. But most often, many of the provisions of those laws are privileged in the breach, as you pointed out. So despite laws on the books, they are not transformed into action. And that is why the implementation is so very important. And the implementation must involve not just empty words, but a budget for the implementation of the laws. Many of these countries do not have adequate resources that are put behind the enforcement of these laws. As I said, in India, there are far few prosecutors as well as law enforcement officials who are able to then respond and address violence against women. So these laws must be reviewed in order to make sure that these laws have teeth, that they are enforced and they're not just hortatory statements on a statute book, and they must be monitored by a very vigilant women's movement that consists of women leaders like you who articulate those concerns, who are able to go back to your governments, to their countries and say, this is the law, but this is the reality, and you try to bridge that gap. And you hold those stakeholders accountable to the laws on the book. And that is why lawmaking is also important, because you need to have a standard. You need to have a benchmark that you can use. These are not just moral grounds on which you're speaking. You have legal provisions to back your commitments and your arguments. So that is why it's important to have both the moral authority and the legal authority when you speak against these laws. So you have to have these international commitments and the national legal commitments to back your call to end the impunity on violence against women. And most importantly, education. Because you're also thinking, in China, when I was working with the women's groups there to draft their national women's violence against women law, one thing they said was, this is not just about punishment, it's also about prevention. So prevention of violence is really at the crux of what we are calling for. And both the punishment is also important, because that is also accountability. Women around the world in conflict situations say, we seek, not unlike some men, we seek not just retribution, but we seek rehabilitation, we seek restoration of justice. So that's very important to women. And the education is important, the law enforcement is important, and we also have to have a sense where the women's movement, that the state is responsible, but women like you, emerging women leaders, play a role in ensuring the compliance with those laws. So I will not in any way back away from my recommendation for strong laws, because laws become the standard-setting instruments. Without that, you're just talking only in moral terms. You need a strong corpus of laws in order to make that commitment. But that alone is not enough. The enforcement, the implementation, the money behind that, a vigilant civil society, and of course the political will. And that is why your work will never be done as a leader.
Hi, my name is Crystal, and going off Lori's point in terms of legislation, it seems that we need more of systemic change in terms of combating the structural violence in failed states that fail to protect their citizens, women, and girls. But when states are combating extremist groups such as the Taliban in Pakistan and non-state actors, what are some measures that can be taken other than simply increasing the security budget or increasing the amount of police officers in the area?
That's a very complicated question. I think people who have much more experience than I on these issues have struggled to address that issue. And I think I mentioned that before. I think even taking responsibility for these actions, whether it's the Pakistan government or the Afghanistan government, for failure to protect these women is the first step. I think an acknowledgement of the state's failure to protect the girls and women that they are responsible to protect would be an important step, because that shows political will going forward to create a climate, to create the laws, the institutions, to attack the root causes of extremism and fundamentalism as a way that impacts women. And also, this is something that I have talked before too. There is a notion of a masculinization of leadership. So we see even issues of national security only in terms of the masculine. So we see national security only in terms of what men would consider violence, what men would consider impacting national security. But violence against women is a critical national security issue. It goes to the very heart of national security. So if we were to reimagine leadership, if we were to reimagine national security in terms of both men and women, the feminine and the masculine, issues such as violence against women become pivotal to national security and become part of the national security agenda. They are not these, soft, marginalized, let's do that after we secure the state issues, but they become part of national security, the very lexicon, the very fabric of national security. Yes.
Hello, my name is Nancy, and I just had a question, more a comment and a question. As I'm listening to your talk, I am reminded of Bolsa Familia, which is a program in Brazil
Yes.
That gives cash to mothers so that they can educate and vaccinate their children. So I was just wondering, I know that this program hasn't necessarily been implemented in other countries besides Brazil, and it's been quite successful in many parts of Brazil. But I was wondering, what do you think it will take for states to commit to these kinds of initiatives?
Right. So I've studied many of these food for education programs that have been effective around the world. There is one, the Bangladeshi program, Food for Education, has been monitored very carefully to show that it has had the impact that it has it foresaw. It has improved girls' attendance because of food and cash incentives given to mothers. It's important to target mothers because mothers are the ones who then use the money in an appropriate way, the food in an appropriate way, and ensure that girls go to school and it's not that this money or the food is not squandered. India, the Indian Supreme Court ruled on a very important food security case, which really inspired me and really sees this whole issue in a very comprehensive manner, where it calls for food to be provided in the school so that children have to come to school, have to assemble in the school, and also has mothers, calls for the mothers of the neighborhood, the mothers of the children to be engaged in the production of the food, so that also gives them agency, gives them a say in the way the school is run. A place in the child's school is very important for mothers to be involved in the children's education. It provides them with a means of livelihood. They are the ones who come together to cook the meals, so that is also agency and provides them with an understanding of nutrition. And the Supreme Court of India, in fact, went to details on providing the number of calories that the children need in order to remain healthy and to be able to engage in school activities, and the protein content of the food, so that this is protein-rich food. So there are some very interesting, very innovative ways in which the Food for Education program has worked. There are some weaknesses and drawbacks, but some of these programs have been very, very, very effective. There is a program in the city of New Delhi which, given the fact that one of the reasons why fathers don't send their girls to school is because they think it's a waste, because girls have to be given in marriage and they have to be given a dowry. So using that cultural context, the city provides money in the girls' saving account for families below a certain poverty level as money that could be used for her dowry, but you get the money only for each year that the girl attends school. So in order to get that money, to be able to access that money, you have to keep your girl in school. So this becomes a very powerful incentive. So it also, you're using a cultural context as a way to mobilize and advance transformation. Yeah. Anisha?
Hi, my name is Anisha. So my question has to do with the fact that the laws you mentioned require that children go to school from the age from 6 to 14. And having worked with children in India who are about 10 years old, I found that a lot of them stop going to school after they're required to. So what measures would you recommend to keep children in school past the required age?
Right. So the Millennium Development Goals, as you know, call for mandatory primary education. But now it has, now both educators, researchers, scholars know that that is insufficient, that in certain parts of the world we have fulfilled the Millennium Development Goal on primary education in certain parts of the world. But what happens is that in middle school, that there is a dropout rate, and that more must be done to elevate the importance of children remaining in middle school. And I think now there's a call for when in 2015, when the Millennium Development Goals are being reconceived and follow-up action to that is being drafted, and imagine that there be greater attention for children beyond primary education. And as you said, well, that then should become the indicator, not primary education itself, because that then almost abdicates the state's responsibility beyond that level of education. And that level of education is insufficient for citizenship, for you to really function as a citizen and to have full agency and to fulfill the potential of citizenship.
In structuring this question, I thought about the very men who carry out these acts of violence, and what I was thinking about was in the case of Visakha, hopefully I got her name wrong, the woman who sought to stop children marriages, the very men took it upon themselves to punish this, to punish this woman with this horrendous act of rape and violence. And it seems that men feel like they are inherently like sort of given a natural right to sort of commit these punishments. And although I think it's wonderful that the state themselves are already taking the incentive to criminalize these sort of kinds of laws, what I'm wondering is what can be done or has been done to sort of address this very mentality that induces these acts of violence? And do you think this mentality is embedded into the very culture that these men belong to? And how could these sort of cultural practices challenge the act of the state to sort of ensure gender injustice?
Good question. And around the world, there is now a realization that it's not enough for women to be involved in the women's movement or on issues that impact both men and women. So more and more, even laws are calling for men's involvement. So I worked on the gender equality law of Vietnam, and what was revolutionary is that this was very far-reaching. The gender equality law called for work-family reconciliation for both men and women, and the provision of housework for both men and women, and the training of boys in housework and in caregiving, and called upon what is called the, there are these mass organizations in post-communist countries like the Women's Union, and in Vietnam, the Fatherland Front. The Fatherland Front, which is, the Communist Party elders, and called upon the Fatherland Front to play a leadership role in engaging men in caregiving work, in household work. So you celebrate caregiving, what women do traditionally as work that is important for the nourishing of the child and the nourishing of the family. And this is work that men should engage in. And in China, in drafting the domestic violence law, once again, written into the draft law is the need for what they call a white ribbon committee, of boys and men to be involved in calling for zero tolerance on violence against women. So unless men join this movement, you're not really going to succeed. And that is why it's so important, as you say, that first to laws to see and acknowledge the important role that men and boys play through education, through training, through awareness raising, through engagement, and by tweaking the law. Because again, if we see, and this has been one of my favorite areas of areas of lawmaking, these new work-family reconciliation laws must be seen only not only in terms of the women, because traditionally issues such as family leave, child care leave was only seen as primarily a women's issue. But now around the world, you see this is a family leave issue. This is, you need paternal leave. Fathers need to exercise both their right and their duty to take care of their families. And that is one way of changing the culture, where we see that these issues are done only by women, and therefore you diminish the currency of those caregiving activities. You diminish the currency of work that is important to both men and women. Zara, I cannot not have you speak.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is about the cultural entanglement of violence. In a lot of these areas, in a lot of these regions, violence is seen as something that's very private, and women themselves often feel like they shouldn't be taking domestic violence, for example, out into the public. And so even when there are avenues where women can advocate for their own rights, the culture acts as a barrier to them. And so my question is, how do we deal with this, and how do we reconcile this disconnect?
Right, good question. You know, as my talk was primarily based on Malala and the rape victim of India, but this is a universal issue. This is not, I want to make it clear that this is not just limited to India and Pakistan, that this happens universally. In fact, Blackstone's commentary in the British law, you've heard of the phrase, the rule of thumb. The rule of thumb came from that Blackstone said, you can beat a woman with a stick not larger than a thumb. So that's from the rule of, that was the rule of thumb, that you actually have legally allowed to beat up a woman with a stick not larger than a thumb. And that is why the women's movement was so pivotal to changing those norms and making sure that violence against women in the home was not a private issue, but it was a public issue. So this whole false dichotomy between the public and the private was dismantled because of the women's movement, that what happens in the privates are still public. And Secretary Albright speaks of this very, very eloquently when she says, violence against women is not culture, it's a crime. And we need to be very clear about that. There's no culture that sanctions violence against women, and we cannot use culture as a defense. And the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women was also revolutionary, because in 1979, up to 1979, international law was seen as a corpus of laws that would regulate behavior between and across nation states. It was not seen to have an impact on individuals. But the CEDAW, again being drafted as a Women's Bill of Rights, again reimagined the world and said, you know, crimes that take place in the home between private actors is still a public offense. And this have enormous international human rights ramifications. And for the first time, an international convention saw to it that it addressed crimes and actions by individuals, by states, organizations, and individuals. So in Article 2 of the CEDAW, it transformed the whole jurisprudence of international law by stating clearly that the CEDAW addresses actions by individuals, thereby squarely placing the issue of what was hitherto called private acts of violence in the public domain, to be regulated at the national level as well as the international level. So although I know that the cultural defense is used, and that is very powerful, and honor crimes, acid attacks are done under that mantle of culture, where women's lives and agencies and women's actions are regulated under the banner of the family's honor, and women are often sacrificed at the altar of a family honor. That is why, whether it's in Pakistan or Bangladesh or in the Middle East and North African region, honor crimes are now being addressed through the CEDAW. New laws are being drafted, but as many of you have spoken, laws alone, I mean, laws are tip of the iceberg. You need the law as the starting point. Gives you legitimacy, it gives you the credibility to speak on these issues, because you don't need to then have to resort to religion or morality. You have a legal basis. You have a strong legal foundation which cuts across these different cultures. It's a universal lexicon, and that is what the international human rights jurisprudence provides us with too. A universal lexicon, a universal language that is not limited by cultural boundaries or national boundaries. So you have in your possession a lexicon, a vernacular that is universal. So you don't speak as an American or an Indian or an Iranian. You speak as someone who's part of an international citizen. Yes, Kelsey?
I am wondering, in your opinion, what role can women like myself and many of my fellow classmates in our positions as citizens of countries like the United States and others do about the mistreatment of women and girls in nations like the ones you mentioned where these issues are most pertinent?
Right. You know, yesterday I was talking to some of my colleagues, and one thing that was very simple but very powerful was, you know, we need to listen. We need to listen to the women of other countries. I think that is the first thing. And I think, you know, this is what you're doing. You know, listen to each other. You're listening to speakers who come from the real world. So, you know, you're no longer in this kind of insular world of you know, the bubble of, which is a beautiful and enchanting bubble, but it's still a bubble. So you're constantly being exposed and stretched by those who come to speak to you, by your colleagues, and you're brought together specifically to do that, to listen and to share your stories and the narratives, and to listen and to, as I said, you know, we are all Malalas. And I think those who say, you know, we are Americans and therefore you have no right, don't see the interconnectedness of the world. You know, what happens in Pakistan impacts all of us. But that does not mean that you have a right to superimpose your view on other countries and cultures. The idea is to engage with your sisters in a respectful way. They are the ones who are going to be the change agents, but you are going to be working with them, because these issues are not, as I said, just limited to Afghanistan or Pakistan. Those abuses take place here in the US, and as I said, as I speak, the Violence Against Women Act is being reauthorized, and we don't know whether that's going to pass. So do not ever think that you somehow are above all of these issues. These are issues that impact all women. And I think we have to see that through those lenses, that this is not limited or circumscribed to a particular area of the world. And I think you empower all women by whether you work here locally, nationally, or globally on these issues. And you're being given the kind of training and the exposure that is necessary for you to take your place as a leader in the world.
Please join me in thanking Rangita.